Thank you all for coming this morning to our Global Justice Day panel, connecting the local and the global, food, clothing, and shelter. My name is Philip Dalton. I'm the director of Hofstra's Center for Civic Engagement and a professor of Rhetoric and Public Advocacy. I'm very happy you all came this morning. Today is the day that we at Hofstra recognize global justice, a day to pay special attention to the various challenges that people face, not just here at home, but throughout the world. Our modern economy has created a situation where tremendous wealth is created, but only a select few derive the benefits of that. And the gap between those seeing the immeasurable benefits of globalization and those whose labor and value is extracted from them and their communities is widening, and it's being propelled by brutal efficiency. Devoting a day each year to acknowledging these challenges, understanding them better, and recommitting ourselves to fixing them is a priority for the Center for Civic Engagement here at Hofstra. I wish to generally thank all those who invested their time in making this event possible, and I'm certain they'll all be recognized along the way. So I want to take a brief moment to especially recognize CCE fellow Margaret Engel for all the work she did in helping put this event together. I've seen the work, but I've also heard about it multiple times from those who've worked with you. And I wish to also thank Executive Director of Hofstra's Cultural Center, Athleen Collins. These events always come together because of your work and your attention to detail. Additionally, you're always a pleasure to work with. So Athleen, thank you and happy birthday. And now, with no further eloquence, I'd like to introduce Vice Provost Margaret Abraham, who is central to organizing this event. Maggie?
Thank you, Phil, for that warm welcome. Welcome to everybody at this event. Welcome to Hofstra University. As Phil mentioned, I'm Margaret Abraham, Professor of Sociology and Senior Vice Provost at Hofstra University. And I have a wonderful co-moderator, fellow moderator in Jasmin Cruz, a CC Fellow, a Junior in Rhetoric and Public Advocacy, with an associates in communication, a part of the Women's Diversity Network. Before I start, I really want to take also a moment to thank, like Phil, the Center for Civic Engagement, but also all of those who are involved in organizing this panel, because as we know, much goes on backstage for something to happen in the front stage. And so I want to take this moment to also thank all the CC fellows, but also to specifically mention our director, Phil Dalton, Athleen Collins, who Phil has also mentioned, Marianne Trasciatti, Sandra Stackey, Margaret Engel, Callie Wynn, and all the other CC fellows, and of course, my co-moderator. So this panel together, this panel brings together justice organizers and activists to discuss food justice, labor movements in history, housing and community organizing on and off campus. We have the global justice, as you know, is a broad concept that has been theorized and practiced in various ways and is often considered as having multi-dimensions and is multi-level. It includes framing justice in the distribution of goods and in terms of rights. It emphasizes the just access and distribution of benefits and the need to address the problem of unequal burdens and structural barriers. It entails mobilizing and organizing to challenge inequalities and injustices so as to create a more just and equal world. Our aim in this session today is to have our panelists share their perspectives and connect the local and the global. Rather than formal presentations from each speaker, who I'm just going to mention just now, our speakers are Rae Gomes, Executive Director of Brownsville Community Culinary Center, Jean Kelly, Chief Executive Director of Interfaith Nutrition Network, Marianne Trasciatti, Professor of Rhetoric and Public Advocacy, Director of Labor Studies and President of Remember the Triangle Fire Coalition, Margaret Engel, Senior CC Fellow and President of Mu Kappa Geographical Honor Society. So what we thought today, it would be much better to, rather than have just presentations to really use a Q&A format, starting with some questions put forth by our moderators, and then open it up to the audience. The audience may also share comments and questions in the chat box. And here I will now give the floor over to Jasmin Cruz, who's a CC Fellow, as I mentioned, a junior in Rhetoric and Public Advocacy.
Thank you.
Over to you, Jasmin.
Thank you for that introduction. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to start off by introducing this wonderful panel that we have for today. First up is Rae Gomes, the Executive Director of Brownsville Community Culinary Center. After over a decade spent affecting change in all facets of the food system with ties to Central and East Brooklyn communities, Gomes has worked to support community wealth initiatives in under-resourced neighborhoods in Brooklyn and continues to support food sovereignty work both locally and statewide. Gomes is a proud founding board member of the Central Brooklyn Food Cooperative, has worked alongside the Brownsville East New York Food Advisory Council, and has facilitated a process that advocates the equity and inclusion of Black, Indigenous, and people of color farmers and food system workers for New York State agriculture and markets. Then we have Jean Kelly, the Executive Director of Interfaith Nutrition Network. She was among the small group of concerned Long Islanders who established the first soup kitchen in 1983. She is now serving as president of the board for the Inn, and in 2020, the Inn served more than 227,000 meals and had 16,970 guest visits for those needing shelter and extensive support services designed to promote self-sufficiency. A professional staff and volunteer force from all faiths, background, and community support the Inn, which has been recognized both locally and nationally for the quality of its programs. Then we have Margaret Engel, a senior at Hofstra, a triple major in global studies, geography, and drama. This is her first semester as a CCE fellow, along with helping to plan Global Justice Day. She is also working closely with the Long Island Alliance for Peaceful Alternatives. She plans to pursue a career in international relations upon graduating. And Marianne Trasciatti, a professor of rhetoric and public advocacy and director of labor studies at Hofstra. She's also president of the Remember the Triangle Fire Coalition, a nonprofit that connects the people to the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire and explores its continued relevance in the US and globally through the educational programming and arts and activists. So we open this question to all the panelists. Thank you again for taking the time to be here. So I'll give the floor to you. And we want to start by asking, can each of you share with us your perspective on global justice, especially from your work in the context of the theme of this panel?
Okay, I'd be happy to start. I don't know if Rae was supposed to go first, being she was introduced first. It's up to you. As Jasmin mentioned, I'm fortunate to be among a small group of 30 people who had started the Inn, and I'd like to give a very big shout out to Hofstra University because it was actually your chaplain at Hofstra in 1983 who was bringing a group of Hofstra students into Brooklyn to volunteer in a soup kitchen there because there were none in Nassau County. And on their way back to the campus, sitting in a van, they saw a man eating out of a garbage can in Hempstead. And they said to him and the other teacher with them, why are we going to Brooklyn if there's, somebody eating out of a garbage can right here in Hempstead? And because of that action, he put a small ad in the paper, and a group of concerned citizens all came together who knew nothing about the issue of hunger on Long Island. At that point, in 1983, there was only one soup kitchen operating on Long Island. It was all the way out in Wyandanch by the Sisters of Mercy. They were the only ones running a soup kitchen. So we started that first soup kitchen, and that was waking up to a global issue happening right here, which is totally shocking. Still to this day, 38 years later, still shocking to many people to say, how can there be any hungry or homeless people on Long Island because there is such affluence? So you really, all of you connected to Hofstra University in particular, should be very proud of the fact that you actually gave birth to the inn. And some of our early first meetings were in your student center right next to your cafeteria. So ironically, it's still there. They put a plaque up, and a grassroots effort was started. So I'm just grateful to be part of what a local effort was in responding to the issue of a basic necessity of food being missing. And then we went on to do shelters and everything else that needed to be done, that it's not just one thing. People have issues. Once one basic necessity is missing, everybody, it's like a three-legged stool. Once one leg is compromised, the others are as well. And that's what we went on to learn and respond to. So I'm just grateful to be here and to be with other individuals like Rae, who are doing this work in another context, on another level. Everybody uses the tools that are provided to them and goes out as far as they can. But we have to first wake up to the reality that it's happening before you can decide how you're going to work and what you're going to do. So thank you.
Hi, since I was mentioned, I guess I can go.
Yes.
Hi. Thank you. Hi, good to meet you all. Very excited to be here and share, as Kelly said, a different perspective on this work. And so from my bio that was so lovely read by Jasmin, I'm a part of efforts that are very localized, both in Brownsville and Bed-Stuy and Central Brooklyn in general, that takes, a global perspective and applies it locally. And the analysis that I come from is definitely one that is applied as such, global perspective applied locally. And most of what this framework comes from is an analysis of how our food system came to be what it is today. And a lot of what caused what we see today, a lot of the issues and a lot of the responses to the food system have been because of two very important aspects of our food system. One is that it's profit-based. A food system from inception has always been focused on profit, which is why, in order to maximize profit, it was basically done by slave labor, enslaved Africans. And then the second aspect of it, even from that perspective of, sort of using enslaved labor, our food system is a result of globalization and global systems. So what I want to focus on mainly is about, because it's very relevant to our response, or, the country's response to COVID in terms of emergency food. What I want to talk about is how emergency food pretty much came to be the way that it is because of those two aspects of our food system. And so the emergency food system as it exists today is a response in part to globalization and jobs going abroad. So around the 1980s, there was this sharp recession. The poverty rate went to about 17%. Just for, comparison, it's around 10%, I believe now, might have gone up. And, the globalization of the labor market meant that a lot of the good industrial jobs could not compete with the cheaper wages paid abroad. As a result, there was high unemployment. And as a result of the government at that time, there was a deep cut in benefits programs. So people weren't getting SNAP and temporary assistance as much. And there was also what they deem as excess in the agricultural industry. And so all of those factors kind of came together to create what we see today as the emergency food system. Some of the things that we talk about today in terms of food rescue, those large scale emergency food organizations like Second Harvest, they didn't exist until like the 1980s. And it was a result of all of these issues kind of coming together. So the main aspects of the emergency food system are unemployment, decrease in benefits, and what people deem as agricultural waste. And all of those three factors really came together again during COVID. And we see an explosion of the emergency food system as it is today. But a lot of, again, the roots are in globalization and a profit-based system. And so again, with the previous administration that we had before, a lot of what we saw in terms of what happened in the 1980s kind of repeated itself. And again, we're seeing this huge sort of attention to emergency food in the way that we're responding to this crisis. And what I can talk about more, again, is how that sort of has related to the COVID response in general, and how a more sort of localized approach can sort of counter the way that emergency food has sort of taken up a lot of space within our response to food and food systems in general. So I'm really excited to have this conversation. And yeah, I'll just leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you. For the next two panelists, you're open to discuss.
Yeah, I can talk. Thank you everyone for coming. It's really an honor being here. It was an honor to help plan it. I'm really serving on this panel to provide the perspective of a Hofstra student. And I'm a senior now, so I've had a couple years of experience just seeing how global justice works in the Hofstra community and how food insecurity also affects the Hofstra community. And I think as a Hofstra student, having these years here, I've realized how sheltered we are from the rest of the Hempstead community. Long Island is notoriously segregated, and this campus is very cut off from the rest of the world. And although we have so many great initiatives and different organizations working to connect students with the rest of the community, such as the Center for Civic Engagement, it's difficult to get other students to want to take action with food insecurity and other justice issues. So later in the event, I will be plugging a bunch of organizations that are working to do that, namely the Pride Pantry. So I'll talk more on that later. But yeah, just in general, I think like the biggest mission that we have as faculty and students of Hofstra is just breaking down that wall and breaking down the barriers that keep us from the rest of the community, because I live off campus, I'm in the community, I'm a member of it, and I have a responsibility as a member of the community to take action and help justice causes. So
Thank you. And now to the beautiful Marianne.
Thanks, Jasmine. It's just a pleasure to be here with all of you, all these really great activists and dynamic people in the audience. And I think our first speaker said that we use the tools that we have available to us. So the tools that we use at Remember the Triangle Fire Coalition is history, historical narrative. So we are a nonprofit organization of activists founded in 2008. And we connect people to the story of a fire in New York City in 1911, which feels like a long time ago, and yet it's really not. This was a fire that happened a block east of Washington Square Park, on the corner of Washington Place and Green Street, in a building that is now an NYU building. It was a fire that should not have happened and should not have been fatal. It resulted in the deaths of 146 people, mostly young women and girls, immigrants, Jewish and Italian. The youngest was 14, the oldest was 43. And there may have been even younger workers there, because we know that young children routinely lied about their ages in order to get jobs so that they could support their families. This was a factory that made garments, clothes for women, blouses, shirtwaists. So, we do a lot of activism to get people to think about the shirt on their back, and not just the shirt, but the people who made it and the conditions in which they work, and not just garment workers, but all workers. So we remember this fire because it was the result of the profit motive that inspired the owners of the factory to keep the doors locked, to keep out union organizers, and to prevent theft that was virtually non-existent. But we also remember this fire because it motivated people to militant activism. Workers stepped up their organizing. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union became one of the most powerful and militant unions in the US. Politicians stepped up their activism and created a committee to investigate working conditions around the state that made New York a pioneer in the field of workplace safety legislation, fire safety legislation, child labor legislation, and other people like someone you may have heard of, Frances Perkins, who saw the fire and was so moved by it that she dedicated her life to advocating for workers and said that, in fact, the New Deal began on the day of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911. It also motivated suffragists to call for the vote for women and for women's rights generally, because they pointed to, images of the Triangle Fire and said, when women don't have a say in the laws that govern them, this is what happened. We die. So we do this on March 25th, which is tomorrow, the 110th anniversary of the fire is tomorrow. We are staging a commemoration, which we do every year, but we also do it every other day of the year through our educational programs and through various forms of arts activism. And we do this because we embrace the notion of global justice. And for us, as Maggie mentioned, global justice is a large construct. And the way we define global justice, not to exclude other definitions, but the kind of justice that we work for is worker justice. Most of us are workers. Very few of us can afford not to work. And our identity as workers unites us across race, across gender, across sexuality, religion, nationality, ethnicity, you name it, our identity as workers cuts across it. And for us, worker justice, global justice involves issues of workplace safety, workplace democracy, fair wages, humane hours. And that's impossible without global solidarity among working people. And so that is what we are working for. On March 25th, tomorrow, we will be doing this virtually. I'll provide information for anyone who would like to participate. We stand with workers everywhere who are suffering exploitation. We have stood with airport workers, nail salon workers, laundry workers. This year, we have stood with, garment workers in Bangladesh after the Tazreen fire and the Rana Plaza factory collapse. We spoke of their pain and their suffering. We stand with Italian feminists. We stand with Irish political activists who are discovering their own connection to the fire. We stand this year with essential workers. We stand with West Virginia coal miners who are suffering from black lung disease. That is the justice that we are advocating for. It is a global solidarity. Before capitalism recognized the advantage of globalism, before capital did, labor did. And we, in that spirit of global labor solidarity, we do that on March 25th and all throughout the year.
Thank you. Very powerful words from our panelists. So we're going to go into another question. It's open to all panelists, but we could start off with Rae Gomes. Again, thank you for being here. Let's talk about some of the challenges and struggles. How has this experience in the individual and collective structural level, and what have you seen as the biggest challenge to the goal of justice?
Yes. So I have to acknowledge that my background is I was a journalist, I'm a writer, so I'm always paying attention to narratives and frameworks. I feel like when you pay attention to the way that people talk about an issue, you can generally understand a little bit better where their solution is coming from. And I think, one of the biggest challenges is the framing of a problem, the framing of the issue, where this sort of emergency food system aspect has come about. The framing of the issue moved from poverty to hunger. And so when people saw the problem as hunger as opposed to poverty, what they decided to do, what government has decided to do, was respond to it by feeding people. And so, there have been studies that show a lot of how that framing had been changed. And that framing has justified the growth of the sort of emergency food industrial system. It has also justified cuts in benefits, cuts in temporary assistance, and it has also justified a reliance on the private sector and volunteers to solve the problems that people see on a regular basis along the lines of food insecurity. Again, so when the problem is hunger, the solution is to feed people. And so the change in the government's approach has been both to use food programs as an answer to really what has been caused through unemployment and poverty and increase in poverty, and to involve the private sector as a means to answer these problems. And so government sort of took away its responsibility. I believe Reagan used this term, the most terrifying words in the English language are, I am the government, I am here to help. So really sidestepping its responsibility to make sure that the most vulnerable are taken care of, and sort of leaning on private sector in order to do that. And also increasing the use of what we call Good Samaritan laws in order to do that. And what Good Samaritan laws did was codify that private industry supermarkets would not be liable if people were to get sick from food that had been donated. So really, creating the systems that, we see today by where there's a reliance on the private sector to solve society's most entrenched problems related to access to food insecurity, relying on volunteer-based in order to solve those problems, and really sort of, what this writer, she wrote Sweet Charity, Jan Poppendieck says, more kindness and less justice. So as things became much kinder and the sort of reliance on volunteers to solve these problems, things became less just. And so, I'm sorry, the previous panelist was talking about an increase in workers' justice, and really looking at global justice from the perspective of the worker. A lot of what the approaches in this framework that sort of relied on the private sector looked at was, not necessarily making sure that people had good wages and higher jobs and good paying jobs, but really looking to the private sector and volunteers to create this industry and to sustain this industry by where you're only sort of responding to the sort of superficial problem where, people are hungry and they're going to get food. And so as long as you solve that problem, because the problem is hunger and not poverty, you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. So yes, I would say that the greatest challenge is the framework of what the problem actually is.
And I guess I could follow that very well, and that we're the kindness part that Rae was just talking about, that we are providing that food and the toothbrush and the bed and everything someone needs because they haven't had justice in their life. But in the process, I believe we have also served a purpose in that we are waking people up to the reality that it exists, and they're coming in to help and saying, oh my gosh, this isn't, I don't feel right just doing this. What's behind this? And it's all about their own excesses of what they have, and their sense of they can be benevolent and just bestow their excess on people in need. So we have really opened, I think, a lot of people's eyes in the 38 years to the fact this is an issue that exists. You can be part of it, but that you also need to understand that this is not happening. We're not happening in a vacuum. We're not all by ourselves. Can be encouraged that humans beings in general want to help their fellow human beings, but you have to see the affinity that, do you recognize this as a fellow human being? This person standing in front of you who may not have shoes on, who isn't really even aware of what day it is and which end is up, because they're so traumatized by the profound poverty they're living in. And that's, I think, the greatest shock here on Long Island is for people to understand how many people are living in these states. It's not just a handful of people in certain areas where you happen to glimpse them. In New York City, you can step over people all over, who are begging and will have a sign out. On Long Island, they're very, very hidden. They're in abandoned buildings. They're behind supermarkets. They're climbing into dumpsters, believe it or not, to get food. They're going into clothing bins and pulling the weight of the clothes on top of them to stay warm. And then they're too cold in the morning to climb out. So they have to bang on the clothing bin to get the police to release them. Then they get arrested. It's a vicious cycle of being trapped in poverty. But I think the way that we are going to make change isn't just for a handful of people who woke up and seem to be aware of it. It's really getting the masses of people to be exposed to it. And what we're seeing is people are starving for opportunities to do something meaningful in their life. And we've had, 38 years of people volunteering at the end of their career when they're retired. And they all say that volunteering and being exposed to people in need on this level has meant more to them than their 40-year career of being a superintendent of schools or running a business. And that says something about the fact that we are all here to be of service. And that's the part that I think people have a hard time touching on because it gets too intimate and too personal. But I believe that answering somebody's basic need of food or shelter is the highest level of service. We're all here on the planet to be of service. It's the highest level of service you can provide if you can keep someone alive. And, but I call it the Mount Everest of service. But just like Mount Everest is not for everybody to climb, to go up there, you need oxygen. To emotionally go up and witness people who are living in profound poverty this is not a game show. It's not a reality TV show. This is someone's life. And this is why we don't allow anyone to be photographed or interviewed who's using our services. It is nobody's business who's eating in a soup kitchen. And it's all about dignity and respect. And one of the saddest things, I guess, that I have found as the biggest challenge is how people are treating people who are living in this profound poverty without respect. And after 38 years, one of the saddest things was said in the last 2 weeks that 2 of our guests were standing on the line because we have everything outside now, of course, because of COVID. But as they were standing on line, and my husband happened to be standing there chatting with them, and the one guest said to another guest, "Isn't it nice how people are so pleasant and treat you so respectfully here?" And the other guest said back to that guest, "Yes, it is really nice, but I can't let myself get used to it." And that made me realize that when they're going other places, they are being looked down upon and disrespected on a level that if you can't let yourself get used to it, it means that emotionally you can't take that ride up and down. And that's what I think justice is really about, is respect for anyone who has not received justice yet. In the meantime, they need to be respected and given the basics, obviously, but also the opportunity to, I say, everyone who is living in profound poverty is trapped at the top of Mount Everest. And our job is to go up there and take them down so that they can blend in with everyone else, and that one day no one will have to go up to Mount Everest to see anybody. That's my thought. So thank you.
I'll jump in here. I think that there are, while I was taking notes, there are 5 challenges that we face during the work that we do. The first is ignorance. The US does an awful job of teaching a lot of things, but probably the thing where we are worse at, and this is debatable, but arguably it's labor history. Nobody knows anything about the history of the struggles of working people in the US and how these struggles were connected to the struggles of working people all across the globe. And since they don't know about the struggles, they don't know about the setbacks, but they also don't know about the accomplishments. And so, as I teach a labor studies class, and students actually reported learning, and you can find this online, that Henry Ford gave us the 8-hour day. Well, that's bull, and I won't use the whole word because I promised Maggie I wouldn't use bad language, but that's not true. Working people fought and died for the 8-hour day. Working people of all races, all genders, all ethnicities, right, fought around the world, fought and died for the 8-hour day. So one of the obstacles we face is ignorance, which is why we connect people, getting back to Rae's point about framing a narrative. The story of the Triangle Fire is a powerful narrative. Children understand it because there were 14-year-olds who were, Mommy, why were the doors locked? Why did they have to work? Why weren't they at school? They understand, the anguish, they understand the anger and the mourning that transformed in the aftermath of George Floyd. I think it's really easy to understand how mourning can be transformed into activism, into militant activism. So one of the things that we combat is ignorance through the arts, through education. And also another point, I feel like I'm riffing an awful lot on you, Rae, is Ronald, you mentioned Ronald Reagan, the Cold War. We've been taught that class struggle is a dirty phrase. Well, except that class struggle occurs every minute of every day in the US. It's just the working class that has always got its neck under the heel of powerful people. So the struggle is going on. And so what we say is bring it on, and it's about time we start struggling back. So the Cold War is another obstacle, getting out from under that framing that says that we can't talk about class, that if you talk about class, you're engaging in class warfare, that says that we can't talk about economic inequality. That's something that we are working to shift. And I love hearing this language about how we need to shift that way of speaking. Social division is another. Again, our identity as workers, I think, really helps us to bridge that divide, but we don't all experience our work life the same way. And that is something that we need to respect and to elevate the voices. And I think, for example, the strike and the organizing campaign in Bessemer, Alabama right now. Imagine if Amazon gets unionized in Bessemer, in Alabama, in a town named after the steel making process by Black women who started their campaign during Black History Month and are ending it during Women's History Month, right? So that kind of social division, not respecting the things that divide, that make us different, even as we celebrate the things that bring us together. The third is consumerism. All too often, we don't think about, we engage in, or we embrace what's called commodity fetishism, the object, but not the process that brought it into our lives. And we need to think about the people who make the clothes, look at the tags on your clothes. Where were your clothes made? Under what conditions were your clothes made? That's something that we try to call to people's attention. And then finally, globalization. It's a beautiful thing, right? I interviewed with a dear friend, a leading garment labor activist, Kalpona actor, who was talking about how workers in the struggle against low wage work and exploitative work, they celebrate each other's triumphs on their cell phones. They watch videos of workers celebrating around the globe. They'll be watching Bessemer when hopefully they celebrate creating the first Amazon union. Right? But at the same time, globalization has created this global supply chain. In 1911, it was really difficult to hold the owners of the Triangle factory responsible because they engaged in what was called the contract system. They hired a guy who hired workers, and so they could claim ignorance because they had guys in between them, buffering them from the consequences of locked doors and low, and other forms of workplace exploitation. Well, now the supply chain has gone global. That makes it even more difficult to identify the culprits, to target the places where intervention is required. So we need to keep shedding light on the global supply chain and looking for the places where we can exploit our power as working people and as consumers to hold these people responsible for the way they treat the people who make the clothes that we wear and who do all kinds of things for us that make our lives worth living. As Kalpona actor, again, this Bangladeshi activist said in this interview we had with her not long ago, in Bangladesh, it's not 2020, it's 1911. And around the world, we need to keep pressure on the global supply chain, because if we don't, we end up with the situation where, riffing on Margaret's comment, the difference between Hofstra and the surrounding community, that's in some ways the difference between the US and places like Bangladesh right now. And we need to keep in mind that we owe everyone the kind of dignity that comes with work. And those are the obstacles that we are pushing back against.
And I think one of the greatest obstacles for Hofstra students and just in general, people my age, is that especially in the middle of a pandemic, it's so hard to like think outside of yourself and your own box and your own responsibilities. On top of that, Zoom fatigue and pandemic depression is so real and so brutal. And even though it's physically easier to meet with people and talk about global justice issues and think of solutions and think of next moves, Zoom and online communication in general is just so mentally taxing. And especially when students and professors alike at Hofstra have to basically sit at their computers all day. And so I think that's a reason that a lot of movements towards global justice that are centered around student activism fall through sometimes. It's also difficult to know what is performative activism and what is actual, real, concrete activism. This summer, we saw so many Instagram infographics and awareness videos, and that was great to learn so much about social justice issues in the US and around the world. But I think once it kind of fell out of the news and the mainstream media, that's when the activism started getting less prevalent. So I think that's also a huge obstacle, is just persevering, and even if it's out of the news, keep talking about it and keep organizing and keep taking action.
Thank you. Thank you so much. A lot of insightful comments here, and things that people want to respond. I just want to make it a point, as it's Global Justice Day, I do work some of the work around farmer protests, about farmer protests, and we've been seeing this globally. And I think as those of us who are in the United States, it's important to understand, and I think we do, that actually many of the movements that we're seeing across the world are places that we can take lessons from. That it's not about us giving lessons there, but it's that we can actually learn historically and contextually from some of the amazing movements where students are actually doing incredible, young people are doing leadership work, but also the ways the local and the global connect in the context of these, around the issues of food and food insecurity, and the framing particularly of these issues, as though they, by governments, as people who protest as, being non-citizens or being anarchists in other ways. And so I think it's kind of an important moment for us to take those lessons from around the world and intersect the local and the global, but also the individual and the collective as ways for structural change. And I must confess, I took that as my prerogative as a moderator, but I did feel it was important to make that comment as it's Global Justice Day today. Absolutely. So one of the things that has come up for many of us, and the question that we would want all the panelists to discuss, during this global pandemic, once again, some of the key issues around framing, as well as the actions around food justice, clothing and the garment industry, as well as housing, have come up. And we hope that you can give us a few insights as to how your organization or group or the movement in general has had to respond or pivot during this pandemic.
Yeah, I'm really excited to answer this question. And thank you for bringing up the farmers. I was actually lamenting to a friend of mine that I don't know enough to bring it into this conversation. And so I was really hoping that someone would. But I know that there are ways that we could definitely connect this to, a lot of what we're seeing in the food system in general, and think about, how we're organizing, locally with a global sort of framework in mind. Yeah, so I definitely want to explore more. So anything that you want to send me on that, I'm happy to receive it and to talk more about that specifically. But in general, COVID exacerbated already existing inequities. And so a lot of those inequities obviously existed before. If you were Black and Brown, you had to experience those inequities at length, and you experienced more because of COVID. Where food insecurity is involved specifically, the emergency food approach that I keep harping back to has not moved the needle on food insecurity. When it started around 30 years ago, started in the way of the sort of industry, like Like pantries had existed long before there was a real industry, what, Andrew Fisher calls the hunger industrial complex. It had existed, before that, but when it became an industry, and really said that it would address this problem around food insecurity and hunger, food insecurity, the level of food insecurity was around 12% and is about 12% now. So it has not moved the needle. The thing about it, and I saw a question that kind of pertained to that, you can work on people's current needs and also address their entrenched needs. You can apply something that Fred Hampton used to talk about. Fred Hampton, who's part of the Black Panther Party, who instituted the breakfast program, the free breakfast program, survival programs. He talked about something called survival pending revolution, that you work on people's needs right now, the things that they need right now while doing the revolution. And so I think the issue is that we've focused way too much on the survival and less on the revolution. And the revolution really does come from the people. It shouldn't come from an organization. It shouldn't come from a pantry. It shouldn't come from a nonprofit. But I'm the executive director of a nonprofit. I see my role as supporting people in their growth towards revolution and providing resources and space in order for them to enact a revolution, because there's no real way that any of this gets addressed unless people have the space to organize, have the resources that they need in the time that they're organizing, and they're able to create their own self-determination and agency in order to create sustainable change. So again, focusing on the survival has been the modality of the government, of a lot of nonprofits, of a lot of, sort of supposedly justice-centered organizations, but again, because, people do focus on what Jean has been talking about, all of these very, very emotionally charged visions of people going through the most desperate circumstances in their lives. You want to help, you want to be a part of that framework that is responding to the needs that people have as you see them. But again, not to be cliched, and I'm going to hate myself for this after this, but it really is an iceberg. And so really just addressing the tip is not going to really address what those underlying causes are. And the underlying causes are systemic inequities. And the only way to really address that is to work with people to address what you see on the surface, but also what you do not see at the bottom of the sea. So, some of the frameworks that I try to employ in the work that I'm doing is really focusing on community self-determination. Mm-hmm. And what that means, specifically around food, is looking at the food distribution system and finding ways that the community can take ownership over each aspect of the food distribution system. Because for the most part, a lot of it, because our food system, from inception is focused on profit, it has left people behind. And so to sort of respond to that in a responsible and sustainable way, we look at what people need and not what will make money. That's the bottom line, so looking at it from a very sort of localized perspective, how do you respond to the needs of this community? How do you bring people to the table? What do they need in order to be at the table to create these solutions and to create the knowledge and the consciousness to sustain these solutions? So, I look at it from the perspective of, what do they need right now to survive? People need benefits programs. They may need food today. We respond by giving people the food that they need today, the food that they may need for a couple of moments, but how are you building up their agency so that they can get the food and sort of decide what food comes into the community? Because again, with emergency food systems, the community is not at the table to decide what comes into their community. They can't necessarily, that whole adage, beggars can't be choosers, people are, getting things that they don't recognize in their community. I'm part of a food advisory council where a lot of our conversation is around the USDA farm to boxes, where people were getting Scrapple. And people in New York are like, what is Scrapple? What do I do with this? And, that being sort of like the protein option, whereas people were getting, chicken breast before. But again, if you're not in the position to choose because you don't have ownership over that process, then you're really on the receiving end of whatever it is left, whatever waste is left. So again, supporting people's ability to change, creating space and providing resources so that they can do that. I talk a lot about benefits programs because that is a way that people can sustain their lives. I've been the recipient of benefits programs. I've been on SNAP, temporary assistance, all of those things, and have gotten to a point in my life where I can sustain myself and my family through those means. So I do promote them because I see them as a way towards self-determination and self-agency, more so than I see emergency food fulfilling those needs. And so, supporting efforts around local organizing, consciousness raising, political education, all of those things are super important so that people have the consciousness to maintain and sustain a revolutionary approach to solving our problems.
Thank you, Rae.
I want to riff on something Maggie said a minute ago, and that is the relationship between the U.S. and the rest of the world. And I think with regard to workers' rights, we have this tendency to think, oh, over there are problems. And I think one of the things that COVID showed us is that we treat working people terribly here. And so the crisis with essential workers, which the coalition, as I said, we have. We advocate for the rights of essential workers. There are triangle workers today. They are the people who are facing horrific, in some cases, horrific conditions, unsafe conditions. And so we advocate for them in response to COVID. But there are also garment workers who are facing extraordinary issues around the world. The biggest one perhaps being wage theft. Because of canceled orders, a number of buyers have lost their jobs, but a number of workers, most of them women, many of them young women, have had their wages stolen. This is a kind of shock doctrine in the garment industry. Oh, people aren't shopping as much. We're just going to cancel our orders or not pay for our orders. And so as you go lower down the economic ladder in the garment industry, those are the people who suffer more. So we've had $22 billion in wage theft for workers in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh, and in other countries that do the bulk of manufacturing. Luckily, there's an organization that was founded. It's called Pay Up. It's a collaboration of NGOs, workers, and activists to secure $22 billion, and there's still more that's owed, from brands who had initially refused to pay. And these are the places like Kohl's, Sears, Forever 21, H&M, Gap, The Children's Place, and Ross stores. So again, being mindful of where you shop. But I just want to close by saying it's not just in the global South, right? This transfer of wealth is not just happening from the global South to the West, although that is a terrible thing that's happening. In Italy, there's an online retailer called Yoox. They have forced their workers, 70% of whom are women, most of whom are immigrants, or many of whom are immigrants, and at least 500 of whom are mothers. They have forced them to work a shift from 5:30 a.m. to 10:30 p.m. to meet this uptick in online orders. And so the women there are striking, and their argument is, you're forcing us to choose between life and work, and we won't make that choice. But again, it's not just the West, it's also here in the US. In LA, garment workers who are making PPE are experiencing wage theft, and they are advocating for the Garment Worker Protection Act, which is going through the California legislature. The California House of Representatives has already passed it. We're hoping that it will pass through the Senate. This is a law that will protect garment workers in California from wage theft during the pandemic. And again, these are the people making masks to keep everyone else safe, and they themselves are being exploited. So as Maggie said, we can learn from what's happening in the rest of the world, and we should not assume that these things, that we are disconnected from these things, and we should not assume that we've already solved these problems because we haven't, and we have a lot to learn from the militancy of women in places like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Italy, and LA, but there's still a lot more work to be done.
Thank you, Marianne, for saying that and reinforcing, giving examples. Margaret, would you like to to add to this, or shall we? I know we have we have limited time, so I wanted to also ask you, as you did, this, and then follow up with what kind of recommendations you would give. So do you want to say something before?
Sure. Yeah, just going off of what I had said earlier, I think for student activists and student organizations, the pandemic has really thwarted some of the efforts that could have been made in the past year. But that being said, it was really great to see a lot of organizations still like pursuing what they are interested in and pursuing campaigns to help food justice, like the Pride Pantry, or talk about workers' rights, like in Peace Action, or just all of these clubs and organizations doing stuff to keep the conversation moving, even if it is just having a conversation, because that's really where it can start.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask the last question for the panelists from us, and then open it up to the open up for other questions. Please put your questions on chat if you have questions. So one of the things that has happened, and we all think about ways that we want to help or get engaged. I wouldn't say help. I always say the word engaged in activism, because and so one of the things that we would like to hear, one way or a couple of ways that each of the panelists thinks people can get involved with global justice issues. And we see this because sometimes, for example, the work around domestic violence, recently with the pandemic, there's been much more discussion up front about the intersections of food insecurity and food justice and housing, and how that is related to domestic violence, right? And so the framing is important, but we're thinking that we want the panelists to discuss, what do you think are the ways that we can create alliances and solidarities, both locally and globally? I know you've touched briefly upon them, but if all of you wanted to give, each of you want to give a recommendation or suggestion. Any of you, it's open to any to answer, and then take it from there.
I'll go ahead. So just speaking as a Hofstra student, I am gonna plug the main clubs and organizations that I've been talking about that are really pursuing global justice issues and talking about them, launching campaigns. So that's going to be the Pride Pantry, Hofstra Peace Action, UNICEF at Hofstra, and the Kappa Geographical Honor Society. So I'm going to plug that. But basically, I think just the main thing that Hofstra students are trying to do at this point is, if they're in an organization that is doing the work like that, they're trying to collaborate with other organizations and working to have conversations, launch charity, and just like launch other initiatives to get in touch with the Long Island community and the global community as well.
Correct.
And I'd just like to also add that the reality is that when the pandemic hit, a lot of the people who were staffing the various pantries and soup kitchens all across Long Island, many of them were senior citizens, and their families said, you can't, go in there anymore, because they were concerned for their health and safety. So a lot of them literally closed. We were one of the few that in Hempstead that we remained open, but everybody, we went from 100,000 meals to in 2019 to 239,000 meals, like in 1 year, pushing it all out the door with keeping everyone safe. And all of people in need were picking up for other people. A lot of people don't understand that just because someone was in need, they weren't also putting themselves at risk and bringing them to other people. But that's where the younger people who are part of our volunteer network made an effort to say, I'm going to not go anywhere else and just go to the end, so that I will be safe and I will not be bringing this virus potentially in, because I'm keeping myself safe. So that's really important. That I feel very optimistic that I feel the younger generation, and this is Margaret, is all of you who are attending as students right now, that there's so much hope and optimism and activism on a level that I have not witnessed this intensity. And I think it's pulling all your skills together, and don't be discouraged by the fact that what you didn't get done during the pandemic, because by staying inside and doing what we hopefully are trying to beat this virus. But at some point it will be able to pick up again. But I also worry about everybody's emotional burnout. And that's what I have seen being involved for so long in this, that people are not looking at their own emotional health in getting this kind of information, the trauma that you are actually, you can be saying the words, you can have all the statistics, but at the end of the day, you wake up with only so much emotional currency that you can spend on any one thing. And what we do is we do wellness days on a regular basis. And I also do spiritual retreats, not on any one religion, it's just on our spirits, how to take care of ourselves if you're going to remain committed to this. And, and everyone has a different skill, and we need to find out what is your skill and where are you best able to apply it. And don't give up trying, no matter what group you come to. Things click, and when they click, you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. And that's why I was so grateful to hear Rae talk about her skill of just being a journalist. That means she's gathering the information, but she's processing it and spitting it out so everyone can learn from it. But she's also lived it. So it's easy to do that if you've had a front row seat to living it with your own life. So I applaud you, Rae, in putting that all together. But I just really have to ask everyone to know that going through this trauma of this pandemic is layering trauma on top of trauma that we have. If I have even the thank you letters that I signed to all of our donors, the shock of how many people are giving us money in memory of their same last name, so their spouses have died, they are sending money in behalf of who they lost. And we have to realize we're walking in a society and a culture that has been so traumatized on top of those who are traumatized because of injustice. So you need to be really careful and cut everybody some slack and realize that, especially yourself, do you have the emotional currency every day to go and do the battle you're doing? And if you don't check your own pulse, no one else is going to do it. So you have that responsibility first and foremost. So I thank you for that.
It was lovely. I'll just follow up quickly. The global is local. I think we know that. I think COVID has brought that to the fore. And in terms of approaching problems that are global, you can definitely find a correlation between what you're experiencing locally and what is happening globally. Margaret, I know I hadn't spoken specifically around, college campuses, and, what I kept thinking about is the hunger crisis, or what people are deeming as a hunger crisis on college campuses. I know CUNY is taking an approach to that. I think SUNY is definitely taking an approach to that. And a lot of the approaches are emblematic of the emergency food system, where people are sort of addressing the need and not the cause, not the systemic issues that have the cause. And I think that goes down to, again, how we frame the problem and how we see hunger. When you think about a college student, you may not think about someone who is hungry or someone who has persistent food insecurity. You think about a college student as sort of, someone who's privileged in general, someone who, comes from a background where they didn't have to think about those things. But for a lot of college students who have gotten there on scholarships, on grants, and have taken advantage of the many ways that people can come to get higher education, a lot of them come from families where they are still facing these issues of food insecurity, of lack of consistent housing, of the various needs around living a sustainable and thriving life. And so because we cannot address that, we have not been able to address it as society as a whole, what you see on college campuses are really, sort of emblematic of again, looking at just the tip of these icebergs of how, we are approaching this problem in general. So, one of the things that I have seen, if there are issues within the college community of addressing, we're talking about globalized issues, I would say start with what the local is and see how it applies to the global. If college hunger is an issue, inequity is usually the problem, right? Looking at the problem instead of addressing it through, more pantries, which I think are great. You're addressing the issue as it exists, right? You're addressing the tip. To address the systemic inequities that come beneath, you have to look at racism. You have to look at, injustice in general, inequities in general, all of the things that we grapple with as a society in general. College campuses usually represent the microcosm of it, and usually is seen through the prism of food insecurity. So that's an entry point that I think that, a lot of people can, whether or not they want to talk about it, or sort of kind of out themselves as someone who is going through these things, there is a space for that. There is ongoing advocacy around that. And it's a wonderful entry point to talk about all of these issues that we talk about, outside of college campuses, and to connect with these global issues in general. But to answer the question, focusing locally with a global sort of framework, really brings about how people can start to think about this sustainable change, raising people's consciousness of things that had happened before. Marianne did a wonderful sort of entry point into, history, I guess a survey rather, of all the historical influences that came to the injustices experienced by garment workers, both locally and abroad. And I think, even with that sort of snippet that we had that was, really wonderfully presented, we see those connections on a consistent basis. We see the connections that happen to us, that we're experiencing today, and how literally, like, I'm going to look at the tag on my clothes, and, I've been mindful of it, but you definitely invited me to be more mindful of it. And I appreciate that approach, that, what the literal clothes on my back are representative of global policy. And I think we can find those approaches. We can find those things that are, very close to home, and see how they affect how, the global policies and things that happen outside of the US have affected the ways and the decisions that we make on a regular basis. But in terms of approaching the solution to the problems, look at sustainable frameworks. And a college campus is a beautiful place to do all of that, because you can really test things out. You can really try things out. Look at worker-owned co-ops. Look at, how labor has, historically been approached, and think about ways that you as a college student can, apply different frameworks that you have tested out on campus, or you've talked through and thought about on campus. Look at ways that, communities, both locally and globally, have historically created sustainable solutions for themselves and for people like them. And try to find ways to incorporate that in your activism and advocacy in the problems that you're facing, both on campus and as an individual, as part of the world. So that I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Rae.
Thank you.
I things in the chat for any students. I mean, the thing about fashion, it's so global that if you act locally, you absolutely are having a global impact. So, and I'm happy to work with any students who want to do this. If you want to get involved in a sweat-free communities campaign and make Hofstra sweat-free, let's do it. United Students Against Sweatshops, let's do it. For people who are interested in labor issues generally, Long Island Jobs with Justice is doing really great work. Professor Murillo mentioned the hunger strike by excluded workers. There's also a Fund for Excluded Workers campaign that's going on right now. The COVID relief bill is great, but it doesn't reach enough working people, and those workers that are excluded need help. So you can become an advocate for excluded workers, either by hooking up with Jobs with Justice or any of the campaigns that you see out there. And anybody who's interested, drop me a note, give me a call, we'll work together.
Thank you, all of you, for there's so much to absorb here and take back, and we're recording this too. I just want to open it up. Obviously all of you have given a lot of insights, but also historical and context and framing and practices. And so that kind of all comes together, right? When we think about the global and the local. I want to open it up. We want to open it up now to questions, and there are a few already in the chat. And I'm wondering if you want us to read it out or whether you've had a chance to read it. So Mario Murillo mentions a COVID crisis exposed the structural institutional issues of poverty that Rae Gomes described, and Jean talks about the urgency of need. I'd be interested in seeing how your organization harness the urgency of this most recent crisis to a work on longer term structural issues at the community level. Now, I know you mentioned some of that, and clearly we see now the empire has no clothes. I know all of the panelists address this in some way, but if you want to add more, I'm going to just say the other two also, so that then there is no more. Isabella Burkhardt said, I would love to hear more about the food desserts and the intersectionality of access to food. I've seen a lot of interesting reflections about where grocery stores are located and even the quality of food within these stores across America and more locally in New York. So if you could, we could open it up with those, trying to respond to those questions.
Yeah, I could definitely start with that question. Thank you for that. So this really goes to the question that
Mario Murillo said.
Isabella asked about food deserts. I love that question because this goes to the whole framing thing. The definition of a food desert or a community that is a food desert, I have to say it in quotation marks because we try not to use that term anymore, is the distance to the supermarket and the income level of that community. So if it's a low income level and it has a far distance from a supermarket, it is labeled a food desert. So within that framework, and I do a whole presentation on this, it's one of the best case studies for how a problem is framed and how a solution is created. Within that framework, you're saying that the problem is the supermarket and the lack of supermarkets, therefore the solution is more supermarkets, right? And as your question implicated, that there is a lot to say about the quality available of the food in the supermarkets. One of the organizations that was mentioned in my bio, or the group that I work with, is called Brownsville, East New York Food Advisory Council. And I worked with them to do supermarket surveys where we had young people go in the community supermarkets and actually look at the quality of food in those supermarkets. And what they saw, well, first of all, we realized that people don't really have a framework for understanding what good quality is because they're so used to bad quality. Right. It's really alarming. It's really, really alarming to see that, to have a conversation. Well, I guess some of the food could be spoiled and that's okay. And it's like, well, when you go to other supermarkets in other communities, do you see spoiled fruits and vegetables there? And they're like, no. But people have accepted to a certain degree that this is what is going to be in our supermarkets and this is what we're going to expect. I can go through a whole history, generation by generation, to show how supermarkets have used this framework to really enrich themselves. And to create policy around, I gave the example of the Good Samaritan laws that really help create a need for supermarkets as answer to the problem of low food access. And we've seen over and over how having more supermarkets or, sort of focusing on supermarkets as a solution has not created any sort of equitable access to food sustainably in communities. And one of the efforts I'm also a part of is Central Brooklyn Food Co-op, where we believe, and we're creating a food co-op because we believe that is the best answer to equitable and affordable food within the community. So the term to use is not necessarily food deserts. The term to use is food apartheid, because within that framework, it really brings about the intentional and even anti-Black approach to food inequities that we see in communities that is sustained by policy, racial practices within private sector and government within these frameworks that have maintained the inequities that we see today. So I hope I answered the question. I could go into the weeds with this, but if there's anything in particular that you want clarified, I can do that.
Is anybody else? Jasmin, you wanted to also comment?
Yes. I actually really wanted to thank the panelists. You four really embodied my life. College student, I'm in Hofstra, so, Margaret, we relate. Marianne, my mother used to work at a sweatshop. My parents are immigrants. My mother worked in Honduras, which is a very poor country. I lived off soup kitchens, food pantries, and I really loved Rae talking about the framing because I'm 29 and I'm still struggling. Just because I'm at Hofstra doesn't mean that I'm privileged and I have money. It's all from hard work, scholarships, grants, like Rae said. And my family is still struggling. We're still low income, and it really warms my heart that all four of you are like doing something about it. And it's like the framing is just really incredible to me. Cause like it's not we gotten help. We gotten help from SNAP. I'm on disability, but that's not the thing.
Right.
You know, it's something more to that than just giving us food. So the framing of the language is really important. That needs to be really erased. And I really thank all four of you for basically encompassing my life in like
Thank
one
you.
session.
Thank you, Jasmin. And I really congratulate you on persevering, because you have shown the quality of endurance. And that's what it's about at the end of the day. You have to honor and respect the endurance and the perseverance of people who have struggled on whatever level, through whatever circumstances have gotten them where they are. One of the things I say always at the end, and people get upset about it, I always say that we're working on going out of business. And everyone says, you can't go out of business. And I said, absolutely not. If you don't have that as a goal, then you're not working in the right way. You have to be willing to go out of business. And people say, well, there will always be poor people needing it. And I said, and they even quote, they always love to quote the Bible, that Jesus said, the poor will always be with you. And I said, yes, but there was an asterisk at the end of that line. It said, the poor will always be with you, asterisk. And at the bottom it said, but they're not supposed to be the same ones. You're supposed to have done something to get them out of that situation. And that's what we're doing with a workforce development, getting people jobs, connecting them to wherever they can, and housing. That is going to be another big thing from this pandemic that we are not speaking of. The affordable housing is already horrific, and how many people are behind in their rent now. And even though they're being protected, a lot of them are living in places they don't have a lease. So they are not protected by the fact they can't be evicted because they don't have a legal right to be where they are. So we are working on doing rental arrears and getting people through this very difficult time. But it's really about hold yourself and really applaud individuals like Jasmin and everyone else out there who is making the best of your situation, but try not to put too heavy a burden on the back of having them also advocate while they're in the midst of a boat that seems to be sinking. So we're doing everything we can to just hold everybody together, but make sure that once they get out of there, then they need to walk away. The greatest thing we say to anyone at the end is, we hope we never see you again. And that's our success. Like you don't owe us anything. You'd better not come back here. This was poverty can be on times a pothole. You fall in it, we help you get out of it. You walk on your way. You don't need to come back to the scene of an accident or where this happened. You just go forward. And don't be discouraged about what has happened during the pandemic, because I believe it has shown a lot of people what they needed to see about racism. And racism is really at the core of what all of this poverty is about. It was done on the backs of people brought here illegally. So, that's what I think we need to realize. That's the beginning. If George Floyd died for nothing else, it was for everyone to witness someone being murdered on television, live TV. And this is what I believe the younger generation is going to say. Black Lives Matter is not over. It had to stop on some levels, but it will continue. And now's the time for it to change. Thank you.
I just wanted to respond to something that Andrea Labresca put in the chat about Amazon. A couple things. One, the afternoon panel has Kim Kelly, who is a super bad journalist who's down in Bessemer, and she's actually joining us from Bessemer, and she's awesome. So if you can make that panel, they're all awesome, but Kim will be talking about Amazon. The second thing is, well, actually, the second thing in relationship to it, Jean, is it? Or Jean? Okay. Is that Black Lives Matter was just down in Bessemer, a caravan. So it's a real incredible campaign there, emphasizing that it's a campaign led by Black women who are among the most pro-union demographic in the country. And the third thing I would just caution, if we want to do right by working people, both in the garment industry and in places like Amazon, to be very judicious in our action. So there was a boycott that was called of Amazon a couple of weeks ago, but the Amazon organizers did not call it, and they distanced themselves from it, because what they were afraid of, and I think rightfully so, is that if you call a boycott during a union organizing campaign, what you're saying to people is unions are bad for business. So in fact, what we want is, we want Amazon to organize, and we all want to use Amazon. We want to reward Amazon for organizing and saying, you keep letting you keep being open to, not squashing. I don't even want to say because hopefully the PRO Act, Protect the Right to Organize Act, is passed by Congress, and then it's almost impossible to stop an organizing drive. But we say to Amazon, your workers unionize, we celebrate you, we will use you more. So we want to use the other tactic. And then finally, we've heard from Kalpona Akhter and other garment activists around the globe, do not boycott. Do not look at the labels on your clothes and say, oh, that's made in Bangladesh, I'm not buying my clothes there anymore, they treat their workers poorly. Communicate your desire that companies like wherever you shop from sign on to agreements like the Bangladesh Accord for Worker Safety or the Alliance for Worker Safety. Reward companies for doing right by their workers, because if you boycott, then people lose jobs. If an action is not called for by or endorsed by workers, don't do it. Because you could do more harm than good. So I think we should definitely have, talk about Amazon, but be careful in what actions we call for.
Yeah. Thanks so much for sharing that. I think it's important. I see also in the chat, and our time is up. We have, about 2 minutes, and I want to wrap up. But we want to wrap up. But I think it's important, guys. There are faculty here as well as students. Some of us in our courses, especially around globalization, have talked about showing the context of the roots, but also where things are produced, how they're distributed, and how they're consumed. And so, for example, my class, one of the lessons in the first class is that everybody kind of itemizes every good that they have, where it's purchased, what's the brand, and how, and so you can trace the root. And I think where we're talking about, presentations from people, who are coming back, and we hope you'll come back and give your full presentations. But the idea that we have to talk about structural change, even if it's happening at the individual level, right? And so the idea of boycotting, I think is an important one, is who's organizing these things, and how do we link intersect the individual with the collective and the organization. That's really important, whether we look at Foxconn workers and look at our iPhones and where they're being made, or we look at Uber and Lyft and the policies that are, victories in different places from the different kind of alliances and solidarity to change the organizational structure. And our hope today with this event was to have everybody begin, having a moment to hear these wonderful panelists from different spectrums of life, but who also share the commonalities and differences and ways of framing brought to us, but framing and then how we can translate to action. Jasmin, we want to thank our wonderful co-moderator who has been awesome, and all of you panelists on our behalf. We hope you'll come. Many of you are here. We hope you'll join us for the next session later today. And once again, can we give a round of applause? I don't know if Kathleen, if we can unmute everybody for or at least show by reaction to give a loud applause to everybody who has been on this panel. Thank you for making a difference, and thank you for sharing your words with us.